So, my mum was on the side of my stepdad, and his kids kicked me out, but they forgot that I own the house now. So it's time to take it back. I never thought that my dad's really detailed plans for his estate would mean that our family would fall apart. There's a lot to think about here, and I want to make sure I'm giving you the full picture, so let me start at the beginning. One of the big tech businesses in Seattle employed me as a senior software architect. My dad always had this kind of job in. Dad always used to say that technology is the future. He was really proud when I got into UW's computer science program. He had a profitable construction business, but he wasn't a techie. He had a remarkable knack for predicting trends, though. He started his construction business from scratch during some of the most difficult periods in the industry. He took on projects that other contractors wouldn't touch, using only a pickup truck. Dad always used to say that technology is the future. He was really proud when I got into UW's computer science program. He had a profitable construction business, but he wasn't a techie. He had a knack for predicting trends though. He started his construction business from scratch during some of the toughest times in the industry. He took on projects that other contractors wouldn't touch with a barge pole, using only a pickup truck and his own tools. My mum told me they lived in a small apartment and were frugal, but Dad had this unwavering faith in his vision. He'd often say, the key is to build relationships, not just buildings. That way of thinking got him through his tough early years. Dad's business was unique because of the way he treated customers and staff. Even if it meant losing some bids to rivals who made exaggerated deadline promises, he was a firm believer in open pricing. He lived in a small apartment with his parents and they were pretty frugal, but Dad had this unwavering faith in his vision. He'd often say that the key is to build relationships, not just buildings. That way of thinking got him through his difficult early years. Dad's business was unique because of the way he treated both customers and staff. Even if it meant losing some bids to rivals who made exaggerated deadline promises, he was a firm believer in open pricing and truthful schedules. He believed that if you establish trust first, the profits will follow. His business was renowned for taking on intricate restoration projects requiring both technical expertise and historical sensitivity. It rose to prominence in the Seattle area by the mid-1990s because of the devotion he had developed with his clients and staff. Dad's business survived the 2008 financial crisis when many construction companies were failing. He didn't. He didn't fire anyone during that tough time. He even reduced his own salary to zero and took out a second mortgage on his beloved Mustang. I learned more from watching him handle that than I could have from any management course. He told me that your employees are like your extended family. You take care of them and they'll take care of your business. I didn't realize at the time how much his managerial approach affected my own career. I put a lot of his ideas into practice. He fired someone during that time, but he also reduced his income to zero and took out a second mortgage on his beloved Mustang. I learned more from watching him handle that issue than I could have from any management course. He told me, your employees are like your extended family. You take care of them, and they'll take care of your business. I didn't realize at the time how much his managerial approach affected my own career. I used many of his ideas when I was promoted to team lead at my software business. I established thorough documentation procedures for our code, much as he had kept thorough project logs for every building site. I was able to lead my development team through challenging project deadlines thanks to his attention on fostering good relationships. I met Emily, 34, at a hackathon in my junior year. She assisted in planning the event while pursuing her studies in business administration, despite my lack of sleep. I started using it when I got promoted to team lead at my software business. I set up some really detailed documentation procedures for our code, just like he had done with his project logs for every building site. I was able to get my development team to meet all their deadlines, thanks to the good relationships I'd cultivated. I met Emily, 34, at a hackathon in my junior year. She helped plan the event while she was studying business administration. Even though I didn't get much sleep, she still found my love of code charming. From the moment he saw her dad, he was smitten. He told me that she grounds you. After their first meal together, don't let this one get away. After college, Dad even helped Emily launch her own marketing firm. He introduced her to his network of local company owners, showed her how he drafted his contracts and shared his business objectives with her. He would tell us, Success isn't just about what you know, it's about helping others succeed too. Dad was always sharing his expertise. Those formative years were unique. Emily and I would always make the drive to my parents' house on Sundays to have dinner. We would all sit on the back deck that Dad had constructed and chat about everything and nothing while he lit the grill. Even though he couldn't understand the majority of the technical details of my most recent work, he would still ask it's not just about what you know, it's about helping others succeed too. Dad always shared what he knew. Those formative years were unique. Emily and I would always make the drive to my parents' house on Sundays to have dinner. We would all sit on the back deck that Dad had constructed and chat about everything and nothing while he lit the grill. Even though he couldn't understand most of the technical details of my most recent work, he would still ask in-depth questions. Mum used to say, "There they go again with the computer talk." With a loving eye roll. Dad's pride and joy was the house itself. He purchased it with the proceeds from his first significant construction job in the 1990s, which was a historic restoration project that made his business famous in one of Seattle's older neighborhoods. This lovely craftsman-style home features a wraparound porch and a garage that he transformed into the most Mom always used to say, "There they go again, with their computer talk." With a loving eye roll, Dad's pride and joy was the house itself. He bought it with the money he made from his first big construction job in the 1990s, which was a famous restoration project in one of Seattle's older neighborhoods. This lovely craftsman-style home has a wraparound porch and a garage that he turned into the most organized workshop you've ever seen, with almost fanatical precision. Each tool has its place. Dad handled the house as though it were a living example of his skill. Every renovation was meticulously organized and recorded, and every repair, improvement and paint job was documented in a spreadsheet that he maintained. He'd say that a house is like a living thing, and he'd even demonstrate how to clean the gutters. Or inspect the foundation. He had a maintenance routine that included everything from checking the roof after winter storms to changing air filters. He taught me about subjects other than tools in the workshop, which was also a classroom where he showed me how to do all sorts of woodworking. He was always super careful with the maintenance, like checking the roof after storms and changing the air filters. If you don't look after the little things, they end up becoming big problems. The workshop was like a second home to us, not just for working on cars, but also for all sorts of other stuff. He even made a special workbench just for teaching me woodworking. He was the one who did all the renovations in the garage himself. He used to say that every piece of wood has its own story. When we were working on the pegboard wall with all the tools sorted into different sections, it wasn't just about being organized. It was his way of showing me that everything has its place and a purpose. Our job is to help tell that story. Our family really looked up to that garage. Dad and I would spend hours in there working on his 1967 Mustang. 12. He'd bought it for restoration, saying it'd be a project that'd strengthen our bond as father and son. That vehicle turned into a life lessons classroom. His advice, which I still abide by now, was straightforward: always use the right tool for the job, or shortcuts look tempting, but they'll cost you in the long run. Although Dad might have completed the Mustang project in 1 year, if he'd so desired, it took 3 years. Dad had bought it to restore it, saying it would be a project that would strengthen our bond as father and son. But it turned into a life lessons classroom. His advice, which I still abide by now, was straightforward: always use the right tool for the job, or shortcuts look tempting but they'll cost you in the long run. Although Dad might have completed the Mustang project in 1 year, if he had so desired, it took 3 years. But he was more interested in the process than the final destination. I learned everything from project management to fundamental mechanics from him. We took pictures of every component we changed, recorded each step and maintained thorough logs of our development. This isn't just about fixing a car, it's about learning how to break down big problems into manageable pieces. I found that lesson to be really helpful but he was more interested in the process than the final destination. I learned everything from project management to basic mechanics from him. We took pictures of every component we changed, recorded each step and maintained thorough logs of our development. This isn't just about fixing a car, it's about learning how to break down big problems into manageable pieces. I found that lesson to be really helpful in my profession as a software developer. Emily and I purchased a small home around 20 minutes from my parents' house after we got married, although Dad insisted that we take out the mortgage in our names. Dad assisted us with the down payment. You need to build your own credit history, he clarified. It's about standing on your own feet. He taught me how to install ceiling fans and fix drywall as he worked on our renovations on the weekends. He was preparing me for the responsibilities of home ownership. Even back then, my career was really taking off. I'd just been promoted to team lead, overseeing a team that was creating infrastructure solutions. I enjoyed every second of it, even if the hours were long and the strain was great. During my lunch breaks, Dad would frequently call to check in, without discussing anything specific. He was aware of the demands of. He'd always say, "You can't do everything yourself, just like I can't build a house alone." When Dad first started feeling exhausted all the time, we were discussing the possibility of starting a family, but he put off seeing a doctor, even though Mom was really worried. He'd dismiss our concerns, saying he was working on his largest project to date, a multi. Managing a group and overseeing the work of others, remember to delegate. He would say you can't do everything yourself, just like I can't build a house alone. When Dad initially said he was feeling exhausted all the time, we were discussing the possibility of starting a family. He continued to put off seeing a doctor, despite Mom's insistence. Just working too hard, he would dismiss our worries. He was working on his largest project to date, a multi-million-dollar development deal that would have established his business for the following 10 years. In retrospect, I regret not pressing harder and insisting on those examinations sooner. Perhaps things might have turned out differently. At the time, the business was expanding quickly. Dad was discussing growing into historical restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest and had recently launched a second office in Portland. He has established a reputation for updating the infrastructure of historic structures without sacrificing their character. He would tell so, there was this massive development deal that could have set his business up for the next 10 years, right? Looking back, I kinda wish I'd pushed a bit harder and insisted on those checks earlier. Maybe things would have turned out differently. At the time, the business was growing like crazy. Dad was chatting about getting into historical restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest, and he'd just opened a second office in Portland. He's got this rep for updating old buildings without losing their character. He'd always say, it's about embracing the future while respecting the past. Everything he did, including his personal and professional life, was influenced by his love of preservation. The Mustang was the thing we've been talking about most recently. He was talking about taking it to car shows now that we'd finished the restoration, and he said, we should sign up for the Pacific Northwest Classic. His eyes got all bright like a kid. He was planning for the future right up to the end, saying, show these youngsters what a real muscle car looks like. It all started like his clients. It's about embracing the future while respecting the past. Everything he achieved, including in his personal and professional life, was impacted by his love of preservation. The Mustang was the subject of our last meaningful discussion. He was discussing taking it to car shows now that we had completed the restoration, when he remarked, we should sign up for the Pacific Northwest Classic. His eyes glowed like a child. He continued to plan for the future until the very end, saying, show these youngsters what a real muscle car looks like. It began like any other morning, until everything changed when Mum called. My phone buzzed while I was in an early meeting. We were in the midst of an important project conversation, so I nearly didn't respond, but I had to go out and take it for some reason. Mum was crying so hard she was having trouble speaking. Dad had passed out on a construction site. He had left by the time I arrived at the hospital, according to the physio. It was a sudden and severe heart attack. He was only 58. The weeks following Dad's passing were a haze of mourning and bureaucracy. The funeral. Dad's business was always packed. He was involved in the community and helped loads of people. Suppliers, contractors and even rival businesses came to show their support. Everyone had a story about how Dad had supported them, given them advice or just been there for them when they needed someone to confide in. One old craftsman told me how, despite Dad's business was packed, he was involved in the community and had helped loads of people. Suppliers, contractors and even rival businesses came to show their support. Everyone had a story about how Dad had supported them, given them advice or just been there for them when they needed someone to confide in. One old craftsman told me how, even though he couldn't work during a protracted illness, Dad had still kept him on the payroll. Your father understood that business was about people first. He said that the workers at the company were heartbroken. Many of them had known Dad for decades and told me things I had never heard before, like how he had paid for their college. He paid for one foreman's daughter's college, helped another through a divorce, or stayed late to teach apprentices the ins and outs of historical restoration with pictures and handwritten notes from both clients and employees. The workplace conference room was transformed into an unofficial monument. We were all surprised by how well Dad had prepared. His lawyer, Mr. Anderson, had us all over for a meeting a week after the funeral. He pulled out this huge file that read Family Security Protocol and was written by Dad himself. It was filled with loads of neatly arranged papers with instructions for all the different areas of his land. He was given a 3. Mr. Anderson gave us a tour of Dad's estate paperwork. Each color-coded container had personal notes outlining his decisions, as well as legal paperwork. I've never seen an estate plan this thoroughly in my 35 years of practice. Mr. Anderson remarked that Dad had even included a 5. Mr. Anderson had Dad's estate paperwork all sorted. Each color-coded container had personal notes about his decisions, as well as legal paperwork. I've never seen an estate plan this thorough in my 35 years of practice. Mr. Anderson said that Dad had even included a 5-year business transition plan, with backup plans for various circumstances. After that, Mom started going to her church's bereavement support group. She first met Steve, 58, there. She only mentioned him in passing. Steve suggested this great book about healing, or said it's normal to feel this way. He was one of the group facilitators and had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. Even if it seemed a little early, I was happy that she was receiving support. Emily reminded me that everyone experiences grief in a unique way. Every Tuesday night, the grief support group met up regularly, and before long, Mom was attending church functions with Steve Moore. Often, these turned into coffee gatherings, which then became lunch meetings, and then dinner dates. Our family friends started to worry about how quickly their friendship was developing. At a family get-together, my Aunt Jane pulled me aside because she was concerned that Mom was hurrying into things to make up for Dad's absence. Mom's changes became more apparent. She changed her haircut, started dressing differently, and even threw out the garden that Dad had helped her create every time. I'm not sure about these changes. She said it's time for a fresh start. Dad was hardly ever mentioned by the woman who used to spend hours talking about her life with him. It all happened so quickly, we weren't ready for it. Mom said that Steve was moving in 6 months after Dad died. James, 30, and Lisa, 32, his grown-up kids, thought it would be good to bring life back into the house. I tried to be sympathetic, but it seemed like she was in a rush to replace everything Dad had built. I'm at a crossroads right now. How can I keep on with Dad's legacy? So, Emily tells me to strike a balance, but I can't help but think of Dad's letter. I've got to preserve those memories first. First update, sorry for the wait for the update, and thanks for all the advice you gave on my last article. 3 months have passed since my last post, and things have got a lot worse. Steve's domineering behavior used to bother me, but now he acts as though he owns the house my dad left me. Steve decided to start a big restoration project last month without even asking for my permission. He built. When I visited one weekend, I saw that the contractors were ripping out the bookshelves my dad had made for the living room. It was as if he owned the building. Steve was watching over them and telling them to throw all this old wood in the dumpster. These were the final project my dad and I worked on together before he became ill, so they were more than just shelves. He got angry when he heard about it. I went up to him and he said, "Look, son," with a sort of condescending emphasis on the pronoun. "This house needs to be brought into the 21st century. Your father's taste was well dated. We're doing you a favor by increasing the property value." I reminded him that any modifications required my consent, legally. Mum obviously agreed with him, but he just chuckled and added, "Your mother and I live here." I went up to him and said, "Look, mate," with a sort of patronizing tone, "this house needs to be brought into the 21st century. Your dad's taste was well dated. We're doing you a favor by increasing the property value." I reminded him that any modifications required my consent, legally. Mum obviously agreed with him, but he just chuckled and added, "Your mother and I live here. We don't need permission to improve our home. Steve knows about these things." She acknowledged that he's just trying to help. The woman who formerly loved those bookshelves and used to place her collection of antique teacups on them for Christmas now acts as though they were just taking up room. I showed her dad's thorough house maintenance plans, but she disregarded them as dwelling in them. I told her that we don't need to ask for permission to make changes to our home. Steve knows about all that. She said that she's just trying to help. The woman who used to love those bookshelves and put her antique teacups on them for Christmas now acts like they were just taking up space. I showed her dad's plans for doing up the house, but she didn't like them because they were too old-fashioned. Also, the relationship with Steve's children has got worse. James has taken over Dad's workshop and turned it into a CrossFit gym. While I was on a business trip, he held a garage sale and sold most of Dad's tools. He did this by repainting rooms and putting in modern vinyl flooring instead of Dad's old hardwood floors. Lisa is using the space also. The relationship with Steve's kids has got worse. James has taken over Dad's workshop and turned it into a CrossFit facility. While I was on a business trip, he held a garage sale and sold most of Dad's tools. He did this by repainting rooms and installing modern vinyl planks in place of Dad's meticulously refinished hardwood floors. Lisa is treating the space as though it were her own personal design project. One evening after dinner, Steve grabbed me aside and said, "Since we're paying to live here, we should have our names on the deed." "It's only fair," I had to explain to him, that they don't pay a mortgage because Dad's planning has paid for the house in full. They don't even cover their rent, all maintenance expenses, insurance and property taxes are paid for by me. Emily recommended that we stop making weekly visits now that Emma is here, and I think she's right. No one benefits from the stress in that household. However, taking a back seat has only made Steve more confident. He began sending me bills for improvements that I never approved, and he began making them more regularly. I should be more sympathetic of Mom's new life, don't you think? I'm the one paying the taxes, Emily. She said we should stop making weekly visits now that Emma's here. She's right, no one benefits from the stress in that household. But taking a back seat has only made Steve more confident. He started sending me bills for improvements that I never approved, and he's been sending them more regularly. I should be more sympathetic of Mom's new life, according to her sister who called me recently. I tried to explain Dad's intentions and my legal obligations, but she simply accused me of being trapped in the past. Steve makes her happy, so why can't you just let them make the house their own? She asked. I found out this week that the growth markers that recorded my height from the ages of 3 to 18 had been removed from the kitchen door frame. Every birthday, Dad would measure me and write the date next to each mark. It's just an old door frame, we can't keep every piece of wood just because your father touched it. Mom remarked when I confronted her about it. I now spend more time sitting in Dad's old chair, the only piece of furniture I was able to keep in my own garage. Mr. Anderson advises me to begin considering long-term storage options. Dad used to measure me and write the date next to each one. It's just an old door frame, we can't keep every piece of wood just because your dad touched it. Mum said as much when I spoke to her about it. These days, I'm spending more time sitting in Dad's old chair, the only piece of furniture I was able to keep in my own garage. Mr. Anderson's telling me to start thinking about long-term solutions. Legally, the house belongs to me, but I'll have to make some tough choices about what to do with it eventually. When does being the bad guy become more important than preserving your father's legacy? and when does your whole family oppose you? How do you defend the moral high ground? Update 2. I appreciate all of your advice regarding my previous post. The situation has things have reached a breaking point and I finally made a choice that will most likely change everything. I spoke with my financial advisor about the house situation last week and we found out that we could make enough money from renting it out to cover Emma's future college fund because property prices have gone up by 40% in the last 3 years. I realized that I had been so preoccupied with I didn't think about the money stuff. I thought about the feelings. But when I mentioned it to Mom, she got mad. She yelled into the phone, "You can't do this to us. This is where we call home." Mom worked really hard on the house. She didn't listen when I tried to explain that I hadn't thought about the financial side of things when I let Mom and Steve move in. Everything went wrong when I mentioned it to Mom. She yelled into the phone, "You can't do this to us. This is where we call home. Steve has worked really hard on it." She wouldn't listen when I tried to explain that I was only considering my choices. She kept talking about all the changes they had made, ignoring the fact that I had never given my approval for them. An hour later, Steve called. He was upset, and sounded different from his usual arrogant self. "Listen here," he announced. "In this house, we have established a life because you're missing your father. You." I was just thinking about what I could do. She carried on talking about all the changes they'd made, but she didn't even ask if I was okay with them. An hour later, Steve called. He was upset, and he sounded different from normal. He said, "Listen, in this house, we've got a life together 'cause you're missing your dad. You can't just walk in and ruin everything." He stopped me when I tried to explain the money problems, saying that they now had sweat equity in the property. I told him the house was mine, legally. "There's a reason why Dad left it to me. Your father isn't here anymore. You must think about the living," he replied. I talked to Emily about it, and also to Mr. Anderson. I was trying to explain the financial issues to my dad when he interrupted me, saying that they now had sweat equity in the property. I told him that the house belonged to me legally, and that there was a reason why he'd left it to me. "Your father isn't here anymore," he replied. "You must consider the living." I talked to Emily about it, and also to Mr. Anderson, before deciding on it the following day. When I arrived at the house, Mom and Steve were working on yet another remodeling job in the dining room. They had begun ripping out the original crown molding, which Dad had specifically milled to blend in with the house's antique style. That image made me more determined. "They have 2 weeks to find another place to live," I told them. I told them that I'd thought about it, and that I was going to decide on it the next day. When I got home, Mom and Steve were working on another remodeling job in the dining room. They'd already started taking out the original crown molding, which Dad had made to match the house's antique style. That made me more determined. They had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. Mom started crying straight away, saying I was being heartless and mean. Steve tried to scare me by arguing with me about how he couldn't just throw them out on the street. He started listing all of their local ties, like where they worked, their church and their neighborhood. When faced with challenging circumstances, I kept my cool and was firm, just like my father. The mom burst into tears straight away and accused me of being heartless and harsh. Steve tried to scare me by arguing with me about my inability to throw them out on the street. He started listing all of their local ties, including his job, their church and their neighborhood pals. When faced with challenging circumstances, I kept my cool and stuck to my guns, as my dad had taught me. I declared, "This is my property. Dad left it to me for a reason, and I'm exercising my legal right as the owner." Steve's cheeks flushed and he started listing all the money they had spent on upgrades. I told him that the historical value of the property had actually been diminished by these unapproved alterations. When Lisa returned home and joined the debate, things got worse. Mom used her pregnancy as emotional leverage right away. "How are you able to treat your stepsister in such a way?" I told him that this was my property, that my dad left it to me for a reason, and that I was exercising my legal right as the owner. Steve's cheeks flushed, and he started listing all the money they'd spent on upgrades. I told him that the property's historical value had actually been diminished by these unapproved alterations. When Lisa returned home and joined the debate, things got worse. She used her pregnancy as emotional leverage right away, saying, "How are you able to treat your stepsister like this? She will give birth to a child." Although Lisa's pregnancy is significant to them, I had to tell them that it doesn't affect my property rights, and that she isn't my stepsister. Since then, there's been an ongoing emotional manipulation. Ever since, Mom's whole family has banded together to oppose me. Her sister called, sobbing, and said their parents wanted to make sure Mom was safe. Messages regarding the challenging rental market were left by Steve's brother, a local real estate agent. Long messages: "So, Lisa's pregnant," which is obviously a big deal for them, but it doesn't change the property rights or the fact that she's not my stepsister. Since then, there's been a lot of emotional manipulation, with the whole family against me. Her sister called in tears, saying their parents wanted to make sure Mom was safe. There were messages from Steve's brother, a real estate agent, about the tough rental market. Even distant cousins, who I don't really know, are calling me about Christian beliefs and family loyalty. It's the family friends who've known me since I was a kid who are the hardest to deal with. They're the ones who grew up with me, and now they're telling me how unhappy they are with my decisions. Every call feels like another betrayal. Some of them even say I'm damaging Dad's reputation in the neighborhood, but the thing is, this isn't about being cruel or making money. It's about following Dad's wishes and protecting the things we've worked so hard for. He created it, and it's been heartbreaking to see them systematically destroy all traces of him. The house was his legacy. I've paid for all their expenses, let them live rent-free for years, and put up with their unapproved changes. But enough is enough. They have 2 weeks to come up with new plans, and I'm refusing to give in to Mom's constant demands for more time. Mr. Anderson says the law is entirely on my side, and that I have been more than generous. He's helping me create an official. I'm dealing with the paperwork for the notice to vacate, making sure everything's documented properly. I know this makes me look like the bad guy in everyone else's story, but sometimes standing up for what's right means making tough choices, even when others don't agree. I learned that from my dad. Third update: we appreciate everyone's help during this tough time. Things have come to an end, so this will likely be my last update. I gave Mom and Steve a deadline, but it's already passed. I'm doing the paperwork for the notice to vacate, making sure everything's documented properly. I know this makes me look like the bad guy in everyone else's eyes, but sometimes standing up for what's right means making tough choices, even when others don't agree. My dad taught me that. Third update: we're grateful for everyone's help during this tough time. Things have come to an end, so this will probably be my last update. I gave Mom and Steve a deadline, but it's already passed. The past 2 weeks have felt like the longest of my life. They've been full of guilt trips, constant emotional manipulation, and non-stop attempts to get me to change my mind. Mom did everything she could every day. She'd call, switching between anger and tears. One day, she'd say, "I changed your diapers." The next day, she'd yell, "I gave up everything for you." Steve also changed his approach, trying to negotiate instead of using intimidation. He suggested setting up a formal lease. The last 2 weeks have been torture. It's been non-stop guilt tripping, emotional manipulation, and trying to get me to change my mind. Mom was on the phone every day, crying and yelling. One day she'd be all furious, the next day she'd be in tears, saying how she'd given up everything for me. The next day, Steve changed his tactics. Instead of being scary, he suggested we negotiate, and even offered to start paying rent. But I couldn't trust them to keep to any agreement we made, especially after what they did to Dad's house. When I got there, there were people gathering on the lawn 3 days before the deadline. Mom had got friends from church, family, and even some of Dad's old business partners to help. They'd all written statements about how important family is and how they do things differently. It was like an intervention. I'm getting a lot of flack for I was chastised for 2 hours for being a bad son. The topic of honoring your parents was discussed by Mom's pastor. Dad's old secretary remembered his generosity and was in tears. Even my elementary school teacher came to remind me of the morals my father had attempted to teach me. The hardest part was when Lisa got up and talked about how stress could hurt her unborn child while covering her pregnant abdomen with her hands. While Mom was crying next to her, a few of the church women were glaring at me. It was an expert performance. I learned a lot about how to play with people's emotions, but during this ambush something unexpected happened. I felt really calm as I sat there listening to everyone talk about Dad. People who hadn't even been to his funeral suddenly said they knew what he would have wanted. Dad used to say, "You're ground when you know you're right," and I could almost hear his voice in my thoughts. I stood up and spoke to the group. I said Dad planned everything carefully to make sure his family had a future, and how I'd built this house by hand. I showed them pictures of Steve's unapproved mods, including the historical elements he'd ruined and the fine craftsmanship he'd replaced with flimsy modern fixtures. After that, I gave them a letter from Dad outlining his reasons for leaving everything to me. Some of the elder business associates nodded as I read his remarks about trust, accountability, and preserving his legacy. They understood because they'd known Dad really knew him. I showed them pictures of Steve's unapproved modifications, including the historical elements he ruined and the fine craftsmanship he removed and replaced with flimsy modern fixtures. Then I gave them a letter from Dad explaining why he'd left everything to me. Some of the older business associates nodded as I read his remarks about trust, accountability, and preserving his legacy. They understood because they'd known Dad really knew him. Shortly after, the group scattered, while some looked disapproving. The righteous wrath had subsided, and others gently apologized as they walked away without saying another word. Mom and Steve returned inside. I showed there with Mr. Anderson and a locksmith on the morning of the deadline, although they weren't required. I'd hired a security company to be on hand, just in case the house was deserted. The remainder of their possessions were packed into Steve's truck. Steve couldn't help but give me a last poke. After that, the group went their separate ways. Some looked unhappy, but others just said sorry as they walked away. Mom and Steve came back inside. I showed there with Mr. Anderson and a locksmith on the morning of the deadline, even though they weren't needed. I had hired a security company to be there in case the house was empty. The rest of their stuff was packed into Steve's truck. Steve couldn't help but give me a final poke. But Mom refused to look at me. As he helped Lisa into his pickup, he said, "Are you happy with yourself? Your dad would be so proud of how you've treated your mother." I didn't answer. Dad would have known. I know he had prepared for this possibility. What other reason could he have had for being so explicit in his will? I walked around the house after they had left. I had underestimated how much damage had been done. Builder-grade materials had been used to replace the original fittings. Dad had painted over or taken. His woodwork was amazing, and we spent so many weekends at the workshop that it had completely changed. I don't want to go after Mr. Anderson for damages, but he's documented everything for legal reasons. I just want to move on and fix what we can. Some of Dad's old craftsman friends have been contacted, and they're keen to help rebuild what was taken out. Mom's staying with her sister for now. We've spent so many weekends at the workshop on this woodwork, and it's completely changed. I'm not going to pursue any damages, but Mr. Anderson has documented everything for any legal stuff. I just want to put this chapter behind me and focus on fixing what can be fixed. Some of Dad's old craftsman friends have been contacted, and they're keen to help rebuild the features that were taken out. Mom's staying with her sister for now, and most of my relatives have stopped talking to me altogether. Some of them do sometimes call to have a go at me on social media, though. Steve's kids keep sharing really sad updates about their poor mom being thrown out of her home, but not as many people are responding to each post. Through it all, Emily's been my rock. She reminds me of Dad's letter whenever I start to doubt myself, telling me he believes in my ability to make the right choices. I'll eventually tell Emma about her granddad and the heritage he left behind. Relatives have stopped talking to me altogether, but some still call to have a go at me on social media. Steve's kids keep sharing heartbreaking updates about their poor mom being thrown out of her home, but not many people are responding to each post. Through it all, Emily has been my rock. she reminds me of Dad's letter whenever I start to doubt myself, telling me he had faith in my ability to make the right choices. I'll eventually tell Emma about her granddad and the heritage he tried to preserve, but she's too little to understand what's going on right now. To restore the house to its original state, I'm working with a restoration pro. We can preserve the spirit of what Dad made, but it won't be perfect. Some things can't be reversed. First, the workshop will be restored. The same place where I learned from my dad is where I want my daughter to study. Being the villain in someone else's tale is sometimes the price you pay for doing the right thing. I may never be able to. I'm trying to rebuild the relationships I lost, but I'm okay with the fact that I've kept what my dad trusted me with. As he used to say, integrity is about doing the right thing, even when it hurts, and not about taking the easy route. I think he'd get it. This will be my last update. Thanks to everyone for your support on this journey. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories.